before the Vanderbilts, before the Astors, before Bellevue Avenue became a corridor of marble palaces competing for supremacy, there stood one house that started it all, Chateau-sur-Mer, the castle by the sea. In 1852, when most of Newport's summer visitors were content with modest wooden cottages, William Shepherd Wetmore built something different. A granite mansion that announced a new kind of wealth had arrived in America: China trade money. Millions made shipping tea and silk across the Pacific. And Wetmore wanted the world to know he'd made it. But the house you can visit today isn't the one Wetmore built. 20 years after his death, his son George Peabody Wetmore hired the most famous architect in America to transform it into something far grander. Richard Morris Hunt, fresh from designing mansions for the Vanderbilts, took Wetmore's substantial villa and created Newport's first true palace. The transformation of Chateau-sur-Mer tells the story of Newport itself, how a quiet summer retreat for old merchant families became the stage for America's Gilded Age, how European taste and American ambition collided on the Rhode Island coast, how one family's fortune, made in the Orient, built the blueprint every other Newport mansion would follow. This is the story of the house that came first, the mansion that set the standard, the estate that proved Newport could be more than a summer escape. It could be a statement of power, culture, and permanence. And it all began with a merchant who saw opportunity where others saw only distance and risk. William Shepherd Wetmore, the China trade fortune. William Shepherd Wetmore didn't inherit his fortune. He built it, shipping by shipping, across the most dangerous trade route in the world. Born in 1871 in New York, Wetmore came from respectable but not wealthy origins. His path to fortune lay halfway around the globe, in the China trade that was making and breaking American merchants in the early 19th century. The China trade was brutal: 6-month voyages around Cape Horn or through pirate-infested waters near Southeast Asia. Ships lost to storms, disease-ravaging crews, fortunes gambled on tea and silk that might arrive worthless if fashions had shifted. But for those who survived and succeeded, the rewards were staggering. Wetmore established himself in the firm of Wetmore and Kreider, operating out of New York with connections to Canton. The business model was straightforward, but required nerves of steel. Buy American goods, cotton and ginseng primarily, ship them to China, trade for tea, silk, and porcelain, ship back to New York, sell at massive markup, repeat. What set successful China traders apart wasn't just luck, it was information, knowing which Chinese merchants were reliable, understanding market timing on both sides of the Pacific, having captains who could navigate both treacherous waters and complex trading negotiations in Canton's foreign quarter. Wetmore proved exceptionally skilled at all three. By the 1840s, he'd accumulated what contemporary sources suggest was a fortune exceeding $1 million. In modern terms, that's well over $30 million. For a self-made man in his 30s, it was extraordinary wealth. But Wetmore faced a problem common to newly rich merchants. New York's old Knickerbocker families, descendants of Dutch settlers who'd owned Manhattan for generations, didn't particularly care about China trade fortunes. Money was necessary but not sufficient for social acceptance. The Astors had figured this out, parlaying fur trade wealth into real estate and respectability. Wetmore needed his own strategy. Newport provided the answer. In the early 1850s, Newport was transitioning. Once a colonial seaport rivaling Boston and New York, it had declined in commercial importance but was finding new purpose as a summer retreat. Southern plantation families came north to escape the heat. Old merchant families from Boston and New York built modest cottages along the coast. The atmosphere was genteel, relaxed, unpretentious. Wetmore saw opportunity. Newport had social cachet without the rigid hierarchies of New York or Boston. A magnificent house there could establish him as a man of substance and taste. The seasonal nature of Newport society meant he could entertain lavishly for a few months each year without the constant demands of maintaining year-round social prominence in New York. In 1850, Wetmore purchased property on what would become Bellevue Avenue. The location was strategic. close enough to the established summer colony to be respectable, but removed enough to make a statement. Ocean views, substantial acreage, room to build something significant. He hired Seth Bradford, a prominent local architect, with a clear mandate: build a house that announces arrival. Not a cottage, not a villa, a mansion that would redefine what was possible in Newport. Wetmore married Annie Darby Rogers in 1851, daughter of a respected Providence family. The marriage represented exactly the kind of social consolidation Wetmore sought. Old Rhode Island respectability meeting new China trade money. Annie brought social connections. William brought the means to live magnificently. Construction began almost immediately. Wetmore wanted his showcase ready for the summer season of 1852. In an era when building a substantial house might take 2 or 3 years, this was ambitious. But Wetmore had learned in the China trade that timing mattered. Strike when the opportunity is there. The house that rose on Bellevue Avenue that year shocked Newport. Granite where others built wood. Substantial where others built modest. Formal where others built casual. Wetmore had commissioned the first mansion that treated Newport not as a summer escape but as a stage for serious social ambition. He named it Chateau-sur-Mer, the castle by the sea. Even the name made a statement. Not the traditional English cottage names favored by other summer residents. A French chateau. Continental sophistication meeting American ambition on the Rhode Island coast. Wetmore had succeeded in the China trade through calculated risk and impeccable timing. He would apply the same principles to establishing his social position in Newport. The house was the foundation. What happened inside it would determine whether his gamble paid off. Building the original house, 1851 to 1852. Seth Bradford faced an unusual challenge. His client wanted something Newport had never seen, but the technology and materials of 1851 limited what was possible. Bradford was well established in Rhode Island architecture, known for substantial granite buildings that projected permanence and respectability. Wetmore had chosen him precisely because Bradford understood how to work with stone, how to make a building feel not just impressive but enduring. The design Bradford produced was Italian villa style, then gaining popularity for suburban and resort architecture. The style offered advantages for someone like Wetmore. It was fashionable but not pretentious, substantial but not fortress-like. It suggested European taste without slavishly copying European models. The plan centered on a 3-story granite block with a distinctive tower rising from one corner. The tower served multiple purposes. It provided dramatic silhouette visible from the ocean. It created interior height for a grand central hall. And it announced that this was not a casual summer cottage, but a serious architectural statement. Bradford specified granite from local quarries, massive blocks that required teams of oxen to transport to the site. The construction method was traditional load-bearing masonry, thick granite walls supporting wooden floor joists and roof framing. Labor-intensive, expensive, slow. But it created the sense of permanence Wetmore demanded. The exterior expressed the Italian villa style through carefully chosen details. A bracketed cornice wrapping the roofline, arched windows suggesting Mediterranean precedents. The tower with its viewing platform at the top, offering panoramic ocean views. Wide eaves providing shade and shadow. The overall effect was masculine, solid, confident. Contemporary accounts suggest the house contained between 30 and 35 rooms, substantial for the period but not unprecedented. What made it remarkable was the scale and finish. Rooms with 14-foot ceilings, windows taller than a man, plasterwork and woodwork executed to standards more commonly seen in urban mansions than summer houses. The central hall rose through multiple stories under the tower, creating a dramatic entrance space. Bradford designed a grand staircase as the focal point, allowing arrivals to be staged and observed. In an era when social ritual mattered enormously, this architectural choreography was essential. The construction timeline was aggressive. Ground broken in spring of 1851, the house substantially complete by summer of 1852. This required coordination of multiple trades, consistent supply of materials, and significant financial resources to maintain the pace. Wetmore demonstrated he could marshal the same logistical skills that had succeeded in the China trade. The cost reportedly exceeded $100,000, a staggering sum for the period. For context, a substantial merchant's house in Providence might cost $15,000 to $20,000. A comfortable cottage in Newport, perhaps $5,000 to $10,000. Wetmore was spending an order of magnitude more than his neighbors. Bradford's design included then-modern conveniences. Gas lighting throughout, advanced for Newport in the early 1850s. Central heating system using hot air furnaces, allowing the house to be used outside the traditional summer season. Modern plumbing with running water, though bathrooms remained modest by later standards. The grounds received equal attention. Wetmore engaged landscape designers to create formal gardens, carriage drives, and strategic tree plantings. The property encompassed several acres, enough to create the sense of a private estate rather than just a large house on a lot. When Chateau-sur-Mer opened for its first summer season in 1852, Newport had nothing to compare it to. The Wetmore's neighbors lived in wooden cottages that might have 15 or 20 rooms. They entertained on porches. Their gardens were pleasant but not grand. Their houses were places to escape the heat, not to make statements. Wetmore had built a mansion that functioned year-round if needed, with scale and finish appropriate to serious entertaining. He'd created what would later be called a summer cottage, but was, in reality, a substantial residence that happened to be used seasonally. The house succeeded in its primary purpose. The Wetmores could entertain lavishly. They could host balls, dinners, and receptions that established them as significant figures in Newport society. The architecture itself conveyed that William Shepherd Wetmore, despite his relatively recent wealth, was a man of substance and taste. Bradford had delivered exactly what Wetmore needed, a house that bridged the gap between old merchant respectability and new Gilded Age ambition. It would stand for 2 decades as the most impressive residence in Newport, until the next generation decided even this wasn't enough. Newport, before the Gilded Age. Newport in 1852 bore little resemblance to the marble playground it would become. The town that welcomed William Wetmore's new mansion was still finding its identity, caught between colonial past and uncertain future. The city had peaked as a seaport in the 1770s. Before the Revolution, Newport rivaled Boston and New York in commercial importance. Slave trade, rum distilleries, merchant shipping. Money flowed through the wharves. Grand colonial houses lined the streets. Then came the British occupation during the Revolution, and Newport never fully recovered its commercial prominence. By the mid-19th century, the waterfront was quiet. The great merchant fortunes had moved elsewhere or dissipated. What remained was a small city with remarkable colonial architecture, mild summer climate, and ocean breezes that offered relief from the oppressive heat plaguing cities further south. Southern plantation families discovered Newport first. Savannah and Charleston society found the Rhode Island coast offered escape from summer fevers and humidity. They arrived in June, rented modest houses, and stayed through September. The economic impact was welcome but modest. These were visitors, not residents. They spent money but built little. Boston and New York families followed. Old merchant wealth seeking respectable summer retreat. The Griswolds, the Hazards, the Masons. Names that carried weight in their home cities but craved seasonal escape from urban summer conditions. They built what they called cottages, though the term was relative. Comfortable wooden houses with wide porches, perhaps 15 to 20 rooms, designed for relaxed summer living. The social structure was informal by later standards. Families knew each other from business connections or shared social circles in their home cities. They gathered for beach excursions, sailing parties, informal dinners. The atmosphere emphasized leisure, not competition. Houses were comfortable, not ostentatious. Entertainment was genteel, not lavish. Ocean Drive and Bellevue Avenue existed primarily as country roads. Farms still operated on what would later become the most expensive residential land in America. The Cliff Walk, which would become a public path past Gilded Age mansions, was simply a rocky coastal trail used by locals and adventurous summer visitors. The year-round population of Newport in 1850 was around 10,000. Summer brought perhaps another 1,000 or 1,500 visitors. Hotels and boarding houses accommodated those who didn't maintain their own houses. The Ocean House, Atlantic House, and other establishments catered to respectable families seeking healthy seaside air. Religious observance shaped the weekly rhythm. Sunday was for church, not entertainment. The summer colony attended services at Trinity Church or other established congregations, mingling with year-round residents in a way that would become unthinkable by the 1880s. What entertainment existed was modest. Beach bathing, though with strict propriety about costume and mixed company. Sailing and yachting, though the elaborate yacht club culture hadn't yet developed. Carriage drives through the countryside. Informal musicales and card parties in private homes. The town's infrastructure reflected its modest scale. Narrow streets paved with cobblestones or left as dirt roads. No grand commercial district, just scattered shops serving daily needs. The magnificent Bellevue Avenue of later decades was farmland and scattered estates, but change was visible to those paying attention. The railroad arrived in 1864, making Newport far more accessible from New York and Boston. Travel time from New York dropped from an exhausting overnight steamboat journey to a manageable day trip. This would prove transformative, though few recognized it at the time. Wetmore's Chateau-sur-Mer stood apart from this modest landscape. Where neighbors built wood, he'd built granite. Where others created comfortable retreats, he'd created an architectural statement. The contrast was deliberate and noticed. Some old families considered it vulgar, new money showing off, China trade wealth trying to buy respectability. Others admired the ambition. Newport needed grand houses if it was to compete with other summer resorts developing along the coast. The Wetmores entertained extensively. Balls, dinners, garden parties. They demonstrated that Newport could support sophisticated social life, not just leisurely relaxation. Annie Wetmore proved an accomplished hostess, managing the complex choreography of Gilded Age entertaining while navigating the delicate social politics of established families and arriving newcomers. William Wetmore enjoyed his triumph for just over a decade. He died in 1862, only 40 years old. The China trade that had made his fortune couldn't protect him from illness. He left behind Annie, 2 young children, and the mansion that had announced his arrival in Newport society. His son George Peabody Wetmore was only 12 years old when he inherited one of Newport's finest houses and a fortune estimated at several $1 million. The boy's decisions over the next 2 decades would determine whether Chateau-sur-Mer remained a relic of Newport's early summer colony or evolved into something far grander. William's death and George Peabody Wetmore. 12 years old, immensely wealthy, fatherless, George Peabody Wetmore faced circumstances that would have destroyed weaker personalities. William Wetmore's death in 1862 came suddenly, reportedly from illness, though specific details remain unclear. He was 40 years old at the height of his social success, with every reason to expect decades more of enjoying the position and fortune he'd built. Instead, his widow Annie and their children faced the challenge of preserving wealth and status without him. The estate passed primarily to George, though structured through trusts that protected both the capital and the young heir from making disastrous decisions. Contemporary sources suggest the total inheritance exceeded $2 million, though exact figures are difficult to verify. Even the lower estimates would place George among the wealthiest young men in America. Annie Wetmore faced a dilemma common to wealthy widows of the period. She could retreat from society, living quietly and raising her children away from scrutiny. Or she could maintain the social position her husband had worked to establish. She chose the latter, continuing to entertain at Chateau-sur-Mer and ensuring her children moved in appropriate circles. George's education began conventionally, local tutoring, then enrollment at preparatory schools. But Annie recognized that truly elite families sent their sons to Europe for cultural polish. The Grand Tour, a tradition among wealthy Americans, offered education no domestic institution could match: art, architecture, languages, social refinement. The experience separated gentlemen from merely rich men. In his late teens, George embarked on the extended European journey that would shape his aesthetic sensibility for life. Paris, Rome, Florence, London. The great museums, galleries, and architectural monuments. Private collections accessible only to those with proper introductions. Opera, theater, salon culture. The timing was significant. George traveled during the height of Second Empire France, when Napoleon III was transforming Paris into the grand city of boulevards and monuments that still defines it. The emperor's architects were creating a new architectural language, blending classical forms with modern scale and technology. Young Americans like George absorbed these lessons, bringing them home as templates for their own building projects. Italy proved equally influential. The Renaissance palaces of Florence and Rome demonstrated how architecture could express both power and refinement. The integration of art, architecture, and decorative detail in these buildings set standards that American millionaires would spend fortunes trying to match. George developed sophisticated taste during these years abroad. He learned to distinguish quality from mere expense, authentic artistic achievement from fashionable imitation. He built relationships with artists, architects, and dealers who would later help him acquire art and furnishings for Chateau-sur-Mer. But Europe offered more than aesthetic education. George observed how old aristocratic families lived, how they presented themselves, how they used architecture and possessions to project authority and cultural refinement. He saw that truly elite families didn't just own beautiful things, they inhabited environments that expressed coherent artistic vision. When George returned to America in the early 1870s, he was no longer simply a wealthy young heir. He'd become a connoisseur, someone capable of commissioning and judging serious architectural and artistic work. The house his father had built suddenly seemed inadequate. Chateau-sur-Mer was impressive by Newport standards of the 1850s, but George had seen Renaissance palaces and Second Empire hotels. He'd experienced environments where every detail, from ceiling frescoes to door hardware, contributed to unified artistic effect. The original Chateau-sur-Mer had served William Wetmore's purposes perfectly. It announced arrival, provided space for entertaining, and established the family's position in Newport society. But George had different ambitions. He didn't need to announce arrival. The family was established. He wanted to create something that reflected his European education and sophisticated taste. He also faced practical considerations. The house was 20 years old. Systems needed updating. Fashions had changed. What seemed grand in 1852 looked dated by 1875. Newport itself was changing. New families were building larger houses. The Vanderbilts would soon arrive with resources that dwarfed even the Wetmore fortune. George faced a decision. He could maintain his father's house as built, becoming a guardian of the past, or he could transform it into something that reflected both his taste and Newport's changing ambitions. The choice would define not just his house, but his role in Gilded Age society. He decided to rebuild, not tear down and start fresh, which might seem disrespectful to his father's memory, but to take what existed and transform it into something far grander. To create a house that honored William Wetmore's achievement while expressing George's own vision. For that, he needed the best architect in America. And in the 1870s, that meant one man, Richard Morris Hunt. The Grand Tour influence. The Grand Tour changed how wealthy Americans thought about their own country. George Peabody Wetmore returned from Europe seeing America differently, and that shifted perspective would reshape Chateau-sur-Mer. The European buildings that impressed George most deeply shared certain qualities. They were never accidents. Every room, every detail, every decorative element served a larger artistic vision. The Renaissance palaces he'd studied in Florence weren't just collections of beautiful rooms. They were coherent statements about power, culture, and the proper relationship between art and life. Second Empire Paris demonstrated how modernity and grandeur could coexist. Napoleon III's architects were creating buildings that incorporated the latest technology, gaslighting, modern heating, iron structural elements, while maintaining elaborate decorative programs that rivaled anything from previous centuries. The lesson was clear. Modern comfort didn't require abandoning artistic ambition. George had spent considerable time studying architectural details, how French hotels arranged their principal rooms for both formal entertaining and family privacy, how Italian palaces used ceiling height and decoration to establish hierarchy among spaces, how English country houses integrated libraries and private rooms with grand public spaces. These weren't just aesthetic observations, they were lessons in how architecture shapes social experience. The art he encountered reinforced these lessons. He saw how old master paintings were displayed in purpose-built galleries, how sculpture required proper lighting and viewing distances, how decorative arts, furniture, ceramics, textiles could be elevated to fine art status through quality and presentation. American houses of the 1850s, even expensive ones like his father's Chateau-sur-Mer, rarely achieved this level of integration. George began acquiring pieces during his travels, not wholesale purchasing, but careful selection of items that met the standards he was learning to apply. Renaissance ceramics, French furniture, old master prints and drawings. He was building a collection, but more importantly, he was training his eye. The experience taught him something crucial about wealth and culture. Money could buy expensive things, but creating a truly refined environment required knowledge, taste, and patience. The difference between a rich man's house and a cultivated gentleman's residence lay in these subtleties. European aristocratic families had advantages beyond money. They'd inherited collections built over generations. Their houses had evolved over centuries. They possessed cultural authority that no amount of American wealth could instantly purchase. But George recognized that careful patronage of the right architects and artists could compress that timeline. An American millionaire with sophisticated taste and sufficient resources could create in a decade what might have taken European families a century. This realization shaped his approach to transforming Chateau-sur-Mer. He wouldn't try to copy a specific European building. That would be derivative, the mark of a tourist rather than a connoisseur. Instead, he would engage an architect who understood European precedents, but could adapt them to American circumstances and modern requirements. The house George envisioned would function on multiple levels, as a comfortable modern residence with all the latest conveniences, as a setting for elaborate entertaining that could compete with anything in Newport, as a gallery for the art and furnishings he was collecting, and as an architectural statement that demonstrated his cultural sophistication. He wanted rooms with the scale and proportions he'd seen in European palaces, ceiling heights that allowed for proper decorative programs, materials that conveyed both luxury and permanence, craftsmanship that would satisfy his educated eye, integration of architectural and decorative elements into unified artistic effect. But George also understood American realities. European palaces served families with armies of servants, built in eras when labor was cheap and time was infinite. An American house, even one built for a multimillionaire, needed to function efficiently. The staff required to maintain and operate it had to be manageable. Systems needed to be reliable. The influence of his grand tour wasn't about importing Europe wholesale. It was about understanding the principles that made great European architecture successful and adapting them to create something distinctly American. Grand scale, European craftsmanship, modern technology, and American efficiency. These weren't contradictions. They were the elements George intended to synthesize. He'd spent years observing, learning, and acquiring the knowledge necessary to be an informed patron. Now he needed an architect capable of executing this vision. Someone who understood European architecture as thoroughly as George did. Someone who'd worked on projects of similar ambition. Someone who could translate cultural aspiration into architectural reality. Richard Morris Hunt had designed for the Vanderbilts. He'd studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He understood both European tradition and American ambition. He was, quite simply, the only architect George considered seriously. The meeting between patron and architect would determine whether Chateau-sur-Mer evolved into one of Newport's great houses, or remained a relic of an earlier, simpler era. George had the vision, the education, and the resources. Hunt had the training, experience, and creative ability. Together, they would transform William Wetmore's granite villa into something the father could never have imagined. Hiring Richard Morris Hunt, 1870s. Richard Morris Hunt didn't need the Wetmore Commission. By the mid-1870s, he was already the most celebrated architect in America, with more work than he could accept. But the opportunity to transform an existing Newport mansion into something grander appealed to his artistic ambitions. Hunt's background separated him from every other American architect of his generation. Born in 1827 to a wealthy Vermont family, he'd received advantages few Americans could access. After his father's early death, his mother took the family to Europe, where young Richard developed the aesthetic education that would define his career. In 1846, at 19 years old, Hunt achieved what no other American had done. He gained admission to the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, the most prestigious architectural school in the world. For 5 years, he absorbed the rigorous classical training that shaped European architecture, drawing from ancient monuments, understanding proportion and ornament, learning how buildings could express cultural values through form and detail. The Beaux-Arts method emphasized more than technical skill. It taught architects to think of buildings as complete artistic statements. Every element, from overall massing to the smallest decorative detail, should contribute to unified effect. This comprehensive approach to design would distinguish Hunt's American work from the more pragmatic buildings of his contemporaries. After completing his studies, Hunt remained in Europe through the 1850s, working in the office of Hector Lafeuille on the expansion of the Louvre. He saw firsthand how Napoleon III's architects were transforming Paris. The experience taught him how classical forms could be adapted to create modern buildings with all the latest technology and convenience. Hunt returned to America in 1855, establishing his practice in New York. His training and European experience gave him immediate credibility, with wealthy clients seeking sophisticated architecture. While other architects offered competent but conventional designs, Hunt could provide the European polish that newly rich Americans craved. His early commissions demonstrated his range. The 10th Street Studio Building in New York created purpose-built spaces for artists. The Lenox Library brought Parisian grandeur to Fifth Avenue. Private houses for the Griswold and Marquand families showed he could work at domestic scale while maintaining architectural ambition. But the commission that established Hunt's dominance came from William Kissam Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt family had money beyond measure, railroad fortunes that dwarfed most American wealth. But they faced the same challenge as earlier generations of newly rich families. Money didn't automatically confer social acceptance or cultural authority. Hunt designed the Vanderbilt Mansion at 660 Fifth Avenue, completed in 1883. The house was revolutionary for New York. A French chateau rising 5 stories, with limestone facades, elaborate sculptural programs, and interiors that rivaled European palaces. It announced that the Vanderbilts had arrived not just as rich people, but as patrons of serious architecture. The success of the Vanderbilt Commission transformed Hunt's practice. Every ambitious millionaire wanted what the Vanderbilts had achieved. Hunt could choose his clients, set his own terms, and pursue projects that interested him architecturally. George Peabody Wetmore approached Hunt sometime in the mid-1870s. The exact date remains unclear. George had a compelling proposition. Not a new building on an empty site, but the transformation of an existing mansion into something far grander. The challenge appealed to Hunt's problem-solving abilities. The two men shared important qualities. Both had spent formative years in Europe. Both understood that architecture should express cultural aspiration, not just provide shelter. Both believed that American wealth could support European standards of craftsmanship and artistic integration. The relationship between patron and architect was collaborative, not hierarchical. Hunt visited Chateau-sur-Mer and assessed what existed. Seth Bradford's 1852 design was solid, well-built, properly sited. But it was fundamentally a substantial villa, not a palace. The scale was respectable but not overwhelming. The interiors, while comfortable, lacked the height and proportion necessary for elaborate decorative programs. The exterior, though handsome granite work, expressed mid-century restraint rather than Gilded Age ambition. Hunt saw potential. The existing structure could be retained and expanded. The granite walls provided solid foundation for more ambitious massing. The site had room for additions. The challenge was integrating old and new into coherent whole, making the transformation feel inevitable rather than awkward. He proposed a comprehensive renovation following Second Empire principles. Raise the roofline to create additional height for principal rooms. Add a mansard roof with elaborate dormers, the signature element of Parisian architecture. Extend the house with new wings to increase space and improve circulation. Transform the exterior with applied ornament that would unify old sections with new additions. The plan required sophisticated structural work. Existing walls would be reinforced and heightened. New steel framing would support the expanded upper floors and mansard roof. Modern building technology allowed transformations that would have been impossible just 20 years earlier. Hunt's vision went beyond exterior changes. He intended to gut much of the interior, creating rooms with the scale and finish George's European education demanded. The central hall would become a true great hall rising through multiple stories. New principal rooms would have ceiling heights of 15 feet or more. Decorative programs would be executed by European-trained craftsmen working to Beaux-Arts standards. The scope was immense. Not a renovation in the modern sense of updating and refreshing, but a fundamental reimagining of what the house could be. Hunt was essentially designing a new building that happened to incorporate portions of an existing structure. George understood the commitment required. This would take years to complete. The cost would be enormous, likely exceeding the original construction budget several times over. The family would need to relocate during the work, but the result would be a house that expressed everything George had learned in Europe, executed by the architect whose work defined American Gilded Age architecture. Hunt's fee structure for major projects was substantial but not excessive by the standards of elite architectural practice. His real value wasn't just design skill, but his ability to coordinate the armies of craftsmen, artists, and suppliers necessary for projects of this ambition. He knew which European firms could provide the quality materials American sources couldn't match. He had relationships with sculptors, muralists, and decorative artists capable of executing sophisticated artistic programs. The agreement between George Wetmore and Richard Morris Hunt represented a meeting of perfect circumstances. A patron with the education to appreciate what Hunt could create, the resources to pay for it, and the patience to see it through. An architect at the height of his powers, with the training, experience, and creative vision to transform an existing building into one of Newport's architectural masterpieces. Work would begin soon. Chateau-sur-Mer, William Wetmore's bold statement from 1852, was about to become something its builder could never have imagined. The transformation would take the better part of a decade and establish standards that later Newport mansions would struggle to match. The transformation, 1870s renovation. The renovation of Chateau-sur-Mer began in 1876 and would consume nearly 3 years. What Hunt proposed wasn't simply updating an older house, it was architectural surgery, retaining what was valuable while fundamentally reimagining everything else. The most dramatic change was visible from a distance. Hunt added a full mansard roof, the signature element of Second Empire architecture. The original house had a simple hipped roof with modest overhangs. The new mansard rose steeply, covered in patterned slate, punctuated by elaborate dormers with their own miniature roofs and decorative details. The transformation in silhouette was complete. Where Bradford's design had been solid and restrained, Hunt's was dynamic and unmistakably Parisian. The mansard served practical purposes beyond aesthetics. It created usable space in what had been attic, adding an entire floor of bedrooms and service spaces. The increased height also allowed Hunt to raise ceiling heights in the principal rooms below, creating the proportions necessary for the elaborate interiors he envisioned. Hunt extended the house significantly. New wings added thousands of square feet, creating proper service spaces, additional guest rooms, and allowing the principal rooms to expand. The additions were carefully integrated with existing structure, using matching granite on the lower floors so that determining where old ended and new began became nearly impossible. The exterior treatment unified the composition. Hunt applied ornamental details throughout, elaborate window surrounds, carved panels, decorative brackets supporting the cornice. The granite that had seemed plain in Bradford's design now became the backdrop for applied ornament that was pure Second Empire in character. The house maintained its granite solidity while gaining Parisian sophistication. A porte cochere was added at the entrance, allowing carriages to deposit guests under cover. This wasn't just convenience, it was architectural theater. Arrivals could be staged properly, guests emerging from carriages directly into the entrance hall without exposure to weather. The social choreography Hunt learned in Europe was being applied to American circumstances. The structural work required to execute Hunt's vision was considerable. The existing granite walls needed reinforcement to support increased height and weight. Steel beams, a relatively new building material, were incorporated to span large spaces and support the new floors. The mansard roof required complex carpentry to create its characteristic profile while remaining structurally sound. Hunt brought modern building systems throughout. A new heating plant with greatly increased capacity, allowing the house to be used comfortably year-round. Gas lighting was updated and expanded, with fixtures custom designed to match each room's character. Plumbing was modernized, with multiple bathrooms finished to luxury standards rather than the utilitarian approach of the original house. The window program changed dramatically. Hunt understood that natural light was essential for displaying art and creating livable interiors. He enlarged existing windows and added new ones, carefully placed to light specific spaces, while maintaining the exterior's architectural integrity. The increased glazing created brighter interiors without sacrificing the sense of enclosure and privacy that characterized great houses. Exterior ornament received extraordinary attention. Hunt employed sculptors to create custom carved elements. No two window surrounds were identical. Each had its own decorative program, executed in stone with the precision that Beaux-Arts training demanded. The dormers on the mansard roof featured carved panels, decorative ironwork, and slate patterns that created visual interest across the entire roof plane. The color palette was carefully controlled. The granite remained the dominant material, its gray solidity providing gravitas. But Hunt introduced contrasts through the slate roof, red and black patterns creating texture and visual complexity. Window trim and decorative elements were painted to complement rather than compete with the stone. The overall effect was rich but not chaotic, demonstrative but not garish. Contemporary accounts suggest the renovation cost between $300,000 and $400,000, though exact figures are difficult to verify. For context, the original house had cost perhaps $100,000. Hunt's transformation cost several times the initial construction, reflecting both the scope of work and the quality of execution. The timeline was aggressive by the standards of such comprehensive renovation. Work began in 1876 with planning and initial demolition. Major construction occurred through 1877 and 78. By 1879, the exterior was largely complete, and work had shifted to the elaborate interior finishing that would continue for several more years. The Wetmore family relocated during construction, likely to their New York residence. Managing a project of this scale while occupying the house would have been impossible. The dust, noise, and disruption from hundreds of workers executing Hunt's vision required complete access to the property. Hunt maintained close supervision throughout. Unlike some prominent architects who delegated site supervision to assistants, he understood that achieving the quality he and George Wetmore demanded required his personal attention. Regular site visits ensured craftsmen executed details to specification, and that the hundreds of decisions arising during construction aligned with the overall architectural vision. The transformation of Chateau-sur-Mer demonstrated what was possible when sophisticated patron, trained architect, and sufficient resources aligned. Hunt had taken a respectable but dated mansion and created one of Newport's first true palaces. The house that emerged from the renovation competed architecturally with anything being built in the Gilded Age. Proof that thoughtful transformation could achieve results rivaling new construction. When the exterior work was substantially complete, Newport took notice. The house William Wetmore had built to announce his arrival had been reborn as something far grander. George Peabody Wetmore had succeeded where his father had pioneered. Chateau-sur-Mer was no longer just impressive, it was a masterpiece. But the exterior was only half the story. What Hunt and George were creating inside would be even more remarkable. The interiors, opulence, and craftsmanship. The exterior transformation impressed Newport, but what Hunt created inside Chateau-sur-Mer revealed the full scope of his and George's ambition. The Great Hall became the architectural heart of the house. Hunt opened the space vertically, rising through 2 full stories under the tower Bradford had designed. But where Bradford's hall had been simply tall, Hunt's was a complete artistic environment. The ceiling soared nearly 40 feet, creating volume that allowed for elaborate decorative treatment without feeling oppressive. Hunt commissioned Italian craftsmen to execute the ceiling program. Carved and gilded beams divided the surface into panels, each containing painted decoration. The effect recalled Renaissance palaces George had studied in Florence, but adapted to function as a welcoming entrance hall rather than a formal audience chamber. Natural light flooded down from windows high on the tower walls, illuminating the space while maintaining the sense of enclosure at ground level. The staircase was entirely rebuilt. Hunt designed a grand ceremonial stair that allowed ascent to be theatrical. Wide treads, gentle rise, elaborate carved balustrades. Arrivals could pause on the landing, visible from the hall below, before continuing upward. The architectural choreography Hunt had learned at the Beaux-Arts shaped every decision about how people would move through and experience the house. The library reflected George's European education and collecting. Floor-to-ceiling built-in bookcases in carved walnut held thousands of volumes. The ceiling treatment was more restrained than the Great Hall, but equally sophisticated, coffered panels with gilded details. Hunt designed the room to function as both working library and formal reception space, with furniture arrangements that could support either use. The ballroom occupied much of one new wing. Hunt created a space that could accommodate over 100 guests for dancing, with proportions and acoustics carefully calculated. The walls were treated with silk damask in deep colors. The ceiling featured painted panels framed by elaborate plasterwork. Crystal chandeliers designed specifically for this room provided both gaslight illumination and visual focus when not lit. Hunt's genius was in creating variety while maintaining coherence. Each principal room had its own character, appropriate to its function, but the architectural language was consistent throughout. Ceiling heights, door and window proportions, the relationship between walls and openings, these fundamental elements created unity, even as decorative treatments varied. The dining room demonstrated Hunt's ability to blend grandeur with intimacy. The space was large enough for formal dinners of 30 or 40 guests, but the architectural treatment prevented it from feeling cavernous. Dark wood paneling, a massive fireplace with elaborate carved overmantel, and a beamed ceiling created warmth despite the scale. The room felt appropriate for both formal entertaining and family use. Materials throughout the house reflected both quality and variety. Marble was used extensively but never monotonously. Different colors and patterns distinguished different spaces. Woodwork ranged from simple painted trim in service areas to elaborate carved panels in principal rooms. Floors used parquet patterns that varied by room, creating visual interest while maintaining the practical durability that heavy social use demanded. Hunt paid extraordinary attention to details that most architects would have delegated or simplified. Door hardware was custom designed for each room, bronze fittings with decorative patterns appropriate to each space's character. Light fixtures were not simply purchased from catalogs, but designed as integral parts of each room's composition. Even radiator grills were treated as decorative elements, cast bronze screens that concealed modern heating equipment while contributing to the overall aesthetic. The color palette throughout was richer and more varied than was typical in American houses of the period. Deep reds, golds, rich greens. Hunt understood that color could make large spaces feel more intimate and small spaces feel more significant. But the colors were always controlled, never garish, balanced against the neutral stone and wood that provided visual rest. George's art collection found proper display in Hunt's interiors. Paintings had walls with appropriate height and lighting. Sculpture could be placed where it would be seen from correct viewing distances. Renaissance ceramics and decorative objects had purpose-built niches and display cases. The house functioned as a private museum while remaining a comfortable residence. The integration of modern convenience with historical style was nearly invisible. Radiators were concealed behind decorative grilles. Gas piping was hidden in walls and ceilings. Electric lighting, added shortly after the initial renovation, was integrated into existing fixtures with minimal disruption to the decorative programs. Hunt's Beaux-Arts training had taught him that modern buildings should incorporate the latest technology without advertising it. Service spaces received the same careful attention as principal rooms, though with different standards. The kitchen was equipped with the latest ranges and work surfaces. The servants' quarters were comfortable, if not luxurious, reflecting the reality that maintaining a house of this complexity required a large permanent staff. Hunt designed service circulation that allowed staff to move through the house efficiently while remaining largely invisible to family and guests. The transformation took longer than the exterior work. Plasterers, carvers, painters, gilders, each trade working in sequence, their schedules coordinated to minimize conflicts and delays. Hunt's office produced detailed drawings for even minor elements, ensuring nothing was left to chance or improvisation. The level of control reflected both his training and his understanding that achieving unified artistic effect required attention to every detail. By the early 1880s, the interiors were substantially complete. What Hunt and George had created rivaled anything in Newport. The breakers and marble house would come later, larger and more expensive. But Chateau-sur-Mer demonstrated that thoughtful transformation guided by sophisticated taste could achieve results that raw expenditure alone could not match. George Peabody Wetmore finally had the house his European education had taught him to want. Hunt had proven that American architecture could achieve standards that matched European precedents. Together, patron and architect had created one of the Gilded Age's great interiors, proof that the new American wealth could support genuine artistic achievement. Newport's transformation, the 1880s building boom. While Hunt was transforming Chateau-sur-Mer, Newport itself was changing around it. The modest summer colony that had welcomed William Wetmore's mansion in 1852 was rapidly becoming something entirely different. The 1880s brought an explosion of wealth to America's cities. Industrial fortunes from railroads, steel, coal, and finance created a new class of millionaires with resources that dwarfed earlier merchant wealth. These families needed somewhere to display their success, and Newport offered the perfect stage. The Vanderbilts arrived first among the truly massive fortunes. Cornelius Vanderbilt II built the Breakers starting in 1893, a 70-room Italian Renaissance palazzo that redefined scale in American domestic architecture. The house cost reportedly over $7 million, more than twice what George had spent transforming Chateau-sur-Mer. Alva Vanderbilt commissioned Hunt to design Marble House, completed in 1892. The name was literal, millions of dollars worth of marble creating interiors that rivaled European palaces. Alva's ambitions were explicitly competitive. She wanted a house that would force society to acknowledge Vanderbilt's status. The Astors, Belmonts, and dozens of other families followed. Bellevue Avenue transformed from a country road with scattered estates into a showcase of competing architectural ambitions. Rosecliff, Rough Point, Ochre Court. Each house tried to outdo its neighbors in scale, cost, or artistic achievement. The architectural competition drove prices and ambitions higher with each season. A house that seemed impressive one year looked modest compared to what appeared the next. Architects competed to provide the most elaborate designs. European craftsmen were imported when American workers couldn't achieve the required quality. The costs were staggering even by millionaire standards. This building boom created a peculiar dynamic for houses like Chateau-sur-Mer. Georges' transformation had been cutting edge in the late 1870s. But by the early 1890s, it was merely one of many great houses rather than the standard setter. The breakers had 70 rooms to Chateau-sur-Mer's 40 or so. Marble House had cost millions more. Newer houses had fully electric lighting from the start rather than retrofitted systems. Yet Chateau-sur-Mer retained certain advantages. It had been completed thoughtfully over several years rather than rushed to make a social statement in a single season. Hunt's design was sophisticated rather than ostentatious, demonstrating genuine architectural understanding rather than simply displaying wealth. The house felt like a residence where cultured people actually lived, not a museum piece built purely for social competition. The social dynamics of Newport shifted with the new construction. The old merchant families who had dominated the early summer colony found themselves displaced by industrial wealth. Money alone wasn't enough, but money combined with social ambition and architectural display could force recognition. The Vanderbilts demonstrated that sufficiently massive fortunes could overcome any social barriers. Entertainment became more elaborate and competitive. Balls for 400 or 500 guests. Dinners requiring weeks of planning and armies of temporary staff. Garden parties that transformed entire estates. The scale of social performance escalated in Tanch with architectural ambition. Houses needed to be large not just for display, but to actually function as venues for the elaborate entertaining that defined Newport society. The economic impact on Newport was significant. The building boom employed thousands of workers, from skilled European craftsmen to local laborers. Businesses serving the summer colony expanded dramatically. Hotels, shops, service providers all benefited from the influx of millionaire families and their spending. But something was lost in the transformation. The relatively informal, relaxed atmosphere that had characterized early Newport disappeared. The new mansions came with social hierarchies and competitive display that made summer less about escape and more about performance. The simplicity that had attracted families like the Wetmores in the 1850s was gone, replaced by structured formality and constant social maneuvering. George Peabody Wetmore watched this transformation with mixed feelings, one imagines. He'd been ahead of the curve, transforming his father's house before the great building boom. Chateau-sur-Mer had helped establish that Newport could support serious architecture and sophisticated society. But the explosion of wealth in the 1880s took things far beyond what he or Hunt had envisioned. The house remained among Newport's finest. Hunt's reputation ensured it was recognized as serious architecture, not just expensive display. George's educated taste meant the interiors functioned as both residence and collection rather than mere backdrop for social competition. Chateau-sur-Mer represented a different approach to wealth and display, more European in its restraint and sophistication compared to the aggressive American ambition of houses like the Breakers. By the 1890s, Newport had become what William Wetmore could never have imagined when he built his granite mansion in 1852. The modest summer colony had transformed into the most concentrated display of wealth in American history. Dozens of millionaire families competing to build the largest houses, host the most elaborate parties, and establish their positions in a social hierarchy defined by architectural display and conspicuous consumption. Chateau-sur-Mer had been the beginning, the house that proved Newport could be more than a summer retreat. The building that showed American wealth could support European architectural standards. The transformation that established Richard Morris Hunt as the architect of choice for ambitious millionaires. The mansion had succeeded beyond William Wetmore's dreams, but in succeeding, it had helped create a Newport that bore little resemblance to the world he'd known. The quiet summer colony was gone. In its place stood a gilded stage where America's richest families performed their status for each other in the world. George Peabody Wetmore's political life. George Peabody Wetmore could have been content as a gentleman collector, living off his inheritance and managing his estates. Instead, he chose public service, and that decision shaped both his life and how Chateau-sur-Mer functioned. His entry into politics was almost inevitable, given his family's Rhode Island roots and his personal resources. The state's political structure in the late 19th century favored exactly his profile. Established family name, substantial wealth, education that commanded respect. He possessed every advantage except one thing he'd need to earn through performance: political skill. Wetmore began locally, involving himself in Republican Party affairs in Newport and Providence. The work was unglamorous, attending meetings, supporting candidates, learning how Rhode Island's complex political machinery actually operated. For someone who could have spent his time exclusively among Newport's social elite, the choice to engage with practical politics demonstrated genuine civic ambition. In 1884, Rhode Island Republicans nominated him for governor. The campaign revealed tensions between his two worlds. Newport society viewed politics as somewhat beneath the truly refined. Getting one's hands dirty with electoral campaigns and popular appeals wasn't what gentlemen did. But Rhode Island voters expected candidates to actively campaign, to demonstrate they cared about winning their support. Wetmore won, though contemporary accounts suggest the victory owed more to Republican organizational strength than his personal campaigning abilities. He served as governor from 1885 to 1887, a 2-year term that proved both his competence and his limitations as a political figure. His governorship was competent but not transformative. He supported typical Republican positions of the era: sound money, protective tariffs, efficient administration. He didn't pursue dramatic reforms or build a personal political machine. His approach was managerial rather than visionary, which satisfied voters but didn't create passionate loyalty. After his term as governor, Wetmore returned to private life, but not for long. In 1894, Rhode Island's legislature elected him to the United States Senate. At the time, senators were chosen by state legislatures rather than popular vote, a system that favored exactly Wetmore's profile: wealthy, connected, respectable. The Senate suited Wetmore better than the governorship had. The role required less popular campaigning and more committee work, policy development, and negotiation among peers. His education and social connections served him well in Washington. He could discuss issues with sophistication, entertain colleagues at his Washington residence, and represent Rhode Island's interests with the gravitas his background provided. Wetmore served in the Senate from 1895 to 1913, with one brief interruption. His tenure spanned some of American history's most significant transformations: the Spanish-American War, the Progressive Era reforms, the early stages of America's emergence as a global power. He participated in debates that shaped the modern American state. His political positions reflected his background and interests. He supported naval expansion, appropriate for someone from a state with strong maritime traditions. He backed protective tariffs, which benefited Rhode Island's textile industry. He advocated for the arts and education, reflecting his personal cultivation. His voting record was reliably Republican, but not rigidly ideological. But Wetmore faced a fundamental challenge that many wealthy politicians encounter: how to balance two incompatible worlds. Washington required months of residence and attention. Newport society expected his presence during the summer season. His political responsibilities competed with his social obligations in ways that created constant tension. Chateau-sur-Mer became a retreat from political pressures, a place where Senator Wetmore could become simply George again, entertaining friends, enjoying his collections, escaping the compromises and frustrations of political life. The house served different purposes than his father had imagined, not primarily for social display, but as a private sanctuary where he could be himself rather than performing a public role. His political career brought certain benefits to the house. Washington connections meant interesting dinner guests at Chateau-sur-Mer. Fellow senators, cabinet members, and international visitors gave Newport society access to political figures they might not otherwise encounter. Wetmore could offer something different from pure social entertainment: substantive conversation about national affairs with someone actually making decisions. The balancing act took its toll. Wetmore's health suffered under the pressures of maintaining parallel lives in Washington and Newport. His political effectiveness was limited by his inability to focus exclusively on Senate work. His social standing in Newport was complicated by association with the rough-and-tumble world of politics. He succeeded in both spheres but excelled in neither, the price of refusing to choose one over the other. In 1913, at age 63, Wetmore left the Senate. Whether by choice or political necessity remains somewhat unclear in historical accounts. He'd served nearly 2 decades, a substantial senatorial career, but he wasn't forced out by scandal or dramatic political shift. His departure seems to have been relatively quiet, appropriate for a man who'd never sought the spotlight aggressively. Retirement from politics allowed Wetmore to focus fully on Chateau-sur-Mer for the first time in decades. He could be present for full Newport seasons without Washington obligations pulling him away. He could pursue his collecting and cultural interests without political distractions. The house could finally function as Hunt had designed it and George had envisioned it, a place for refined living rather than a stage for social or political performance. George Peabody Wetmore's political career demonstrated something significant about Gilded Age wealth. Money and social position could buy entry to public office, but they couldn't guarantee political genius or transformative leadership. He'd been a competent governor and a solid senator, serving Rhode Island and the nation with dignity, if not brilliance. His real achievement wasn't in politics, but in demonstrating that serious wealth could support serious public service. Many of his Newport neighbors viewed politics as beneath them or simply irrelevant to their social pursuits. Wetmore proved that a gentleman could engage with democratic politics without sacrificing his cultural refinement or social standing. Chateau-sur-Mer had witnessed this dual life for decades. The house had hosted both social entertainments for Newport society and political discussions with Washington colleagues. It had been simultaneously a private retreat and a semi-public stage. The transformation Hunt had executed in the 1870s had created a building versatile enough to support all these functions without losing its essential character as a sophisticated residence. Now, in the 1910s, the house would enter its final phase, not as a new millionaire's announcement or a political figure's dual residence, but as the home of a retired gentleman who could finally live the life of cultivation and leisure his European education had prepared him for. The family's decline and preservation. George Peabody Wetmore died in 1921 at age 71. His passing marked more than the end of one man's life. It signaled the beginning of the end for the world Chateau-sur-Mer represented. The Gilded Age was dying along with its leading figures. The income tax, established in 1913, made maintaining enormous houses increasingly difficult. World War I had shifted American attitudes about ostentatious wealth and aristocratic pretensions. The social structures that had sustained Newport's summer colony were fracturing under economic and cultural pressures. Wetmore's estate passed to his daughters, Edith and Maud. Neither had married, and both faced the challenge of maintaining a house designed for elaborate entertaining in an era when such lifestyle was becoming obsolete. The staff required to operate Chateau-sur-Mer properly numbered in the dozens. The annual costs for maintenance, taxes, and upkeep were substantial, even for a fortune built on China trade millions. The sisters attempted to maintain the house and their father's collections. They continued summering at Chateau-sur-Mer through the 1920s and 30s, though on a reduced scale compared to George's era. The great parties and elaborate entertainments largely ceased. The house became more private, less a stage for social performance and more simply a residence. The stock market crash of 1929 and the subsequent depression strained even substantial fortunes. Many Newport families found themselves unable to maintain their mansions. Some houses were demolished. Others were converted to institutional uses or sold for fractions of their construction costs. The summer colony that had seemed permanent just decades earlier was revealed to be as fragile as any other social structure built on wealth and fashion. World War II accelerated Newport's decline as a fashionable resort. Young men went to war. Gasoline rationing made summer travel difficult. The conspicuous consumption that had defined Gilded Age Newport felt inappropriate during wartime sacrifice. Many families simply closed their houses for the duration, and some never reopened them. Edith Wetmore died in 1966, the last family member to occupy Chateau-sur-Mer. She had lived there for decades, maintaining what she could of her father's vision while watching Newport transform around her. The summer colony of competing millionaires had given way to a town struggling to find new purpose for its architectural inheritance. The question facing Chateau-sur-Mer and dozens of similar houses was stark: demolition or preservation. The economics favored demolition. The land was worth far more than the buildings. The houses were expensive to maintain and difficult to adapt to modern uses. Many significant Newport mansions were lost during these decades, torn down for development or institutional expansion. But a counterforce was emerging. The Preservation Society of Newport County, established in 1945, recognized that Newport's Gilded Age mansions represented irreplaceable architectural and cultural heritage. These weren't just big old houses. They were among the finest examples of American architecture from a significant historical period, executed by leading architects with quality of materials and craftsmanship that could never be replicated. In 1969, 3 years after Edith's death, the Preservation Society acquired Chateau-sur-Mer. The house became one of several Newport mansions open to the public as museums, joining the Breakers, Marble House, and others in telling the story of Gilded Age America through its architecture. The decision to preserve rather than demolish Chateau-sur-Mer reflected several factors. The house retained most of Hunt's interior decorative programs relatively intact. The Wetmore family's collections, while dispersed, had been partially documented. The architectural quality was undeniable, representing Hunt's work at a crucial phase of his career. And the house's history, from William Wetmore's original construction through George's transformation, told the story of Newport's evolution from modest summer colony to Gilded Age showcase. Preservation required extensive work. Decades of deferred maintenance needed correction. Modern building codes required updates to electrical, plumbing, and fire safety systems. The house needed to be adapted for public visitation while maintaining its character as a private residence. The Preservation Society invested significantly in restoring finishes, conserving decorative elements, and ensuring the building would survive for future generations. The transformation from private mansion to public museum changed Chateau-sur-Mer fundamentally. Rooms that had hosted private family life and elaborate social entertaining now accommodated tour groups. Spaces designed for specific functions were reinterpreted as educational exhibits. The house became an artifact, frozen in time, explaining rather than embodying a vanished way of life. Yet preservation succeeded in its essential purpose. Chateau-sur-Mer survives as one of the finest examples of Second Empire architecture in America. Hunt's decorative programs can still be studied and appreciated. The house demonstrates how Gilded Age families actually lived, the spaces they inhabited, the quality they demanded. Without preservation, all of this would have been lost. The contrast between Chateau-sur-Mer's fate and that of many contemporary houses is instructive. Dozens of Newport mansions were demolished in the mid-20th century. Their sites were redeveloped or left vacant. Their furnishings were scattered through auctions and estate sales. Their architectural details were salvaged or destroyed. Nothing remains but photographs and memories. Chateau-sur-Mer escaped this fate through a combination of factors: the Wetmore family's long occupancy, which kept the house intact longer than many others, the Preservation Society's commitment and resources, and growing recognition that architectural heritage deserved protection even when economically inconvenient. The house now functions as a teaching tool. Visitors can see how Hunt transformed an existing building into something grander. They can understand the relationship between patron and architect. They can appreciate the quality of craftsmanship that characterized the best Gilded Age work. They can glimpse a world of wealth, taste, and social ambition that shaped American culture during a crucial period. George Peabody Wetmore would likely have mixed feelings about his house becoming a museum. He valued privacy and cultivated living. Public visitation was antithetical to everything Chateau-sur-Mer represented during his lifetime. Yet he also valued art, architecture, and cultural education. He might appreciate that his house now serves educational purposes, teaching new generations about American architectural achievement. The preservation of Chateau-sur-Mer represents a broader shift in how Americans think about their architectural heritage. The Gilded Age mansions, once dismissed as vulgar displays or irrelevant anachronisms, are now recognized as important cultural artifacts. They document American ambition, European influence, architectural innovation, and social history in ways no other sources can match. Chateau-sur-Mer's legacy. Stand on Bellevue Avenue today, and you see Chateau-sur-Mer differently than any contemporary visitor would have. Where Gilded Age society saw a statement of wealth and taste, we see a historical artifact. Where George Wetmore saw a home, we see a museum. But the house's significance transcends these changing perspectives. Chateau-sur-Mer matters because it came first. When William Wetmore built his granite mansion in 1852, he proved that Newport could be more than a modest summer colony. The house demonstrated that serious architecture and substantial investment could succeed on the Rhode Island coast. Every mansion that followed, from the Breakers to Marble House, built on the foundation Wetmore established. The architectural significance is undeniable. Hunt's transformation represents Second Empire style at its American finest. The integration of existing structure with new additions demonstrated sophisticated design thinking. The quality of decorative programs set standards that few later houses matched. Hunt was working at the height of his powers, creating something that reflected both European training and American ambition. The house also documents the evolution of architectural patronage in America. William Wetmore was a successful merchant with social ambitions but conventional taste. George Peabody Wetmore was an educated connoisseur who could collaborate meaningfully with a trained architect. The difference between father's house and son's transformation reflects broader changes in how wealthy Americans thought about architecture and their relationship to European culture. Chateau-sur-Mer demonstrates the possibilities and limitations of transforming existing buildings. Hunt couldn't start from scratch. He had to work with what Bradford had created. The result was neither pure new construction nor simple renovation, but a sophisticated hybrid. The house proves that thoughtful transformation can achieve results rivaling new building, given sufficient resources and architectural skill. The house's social history illuminates Gilded Age America's complexities. George Wetmore's political career, his balancing of Washington and Newport, his attempt to be both public servant and private gentleman, these tensions played out within Chateau-sur-Mer's walls. The house witnessed the collision of democratic politics and aristocratic social ambition that characterized the era. For architectural historians, Chateau-sur-Mer provides crucial evidence of Hunt's working methods and design evolution. The house represents a transitional moment between his earlier work and the massive commissions like the Breakers that came later. Studying Chateau-sur-Mer helps understand how Hunt developed the vocabulary and techniques he would employ on his most famous projects. The preservation story carries its own significance. Chateau-sur-Mer's survival demonstrates that community action and institutional commitment can save buildings that market forces would destroy. The Preservation Society's work here and at other Newport mansions helped establish models for historic preservation that have been replicated nationwide. But perhaps the house's deepest significance is simply that it still exists. So much of the Gilded Age is lost. Houses demolished, collections dispersed, ways of life vanished. Chateau-sur-Mer survived largely intact, allowing us to experience directly rather than imagine or reconstruct. The spaces Hunt designed can still be inhabited, even if now by visitors rather than residents. The quality he and George demanded can still be appreciated and studied. The house reminds us that architecture is always about more than buildings. It's about ambition, taste, social relationships, economic power, cultural values. Chateau-sur-Mer embodies all of these in physical form. The granite walls contain not just rooms but stories of merchants and politicians, architects and craftsmen, family life and social performance. Newport today is very different from the Gilded Age resort Chateau-sur-Mer helped create. The summer colony is gone. The social hierarchies have dissolved. The lifestyle these houses supported has vanished. Yet the buildings remain no longer functional residences but invaluable historical resources. Walking through Chateau-sur-Mer today, it's easy to focus on the obvious: the scale, the craftsmanship, the wealth required to create and maintain it. But the house represents something more subtle and more important. It shows how architecture mediates between private aspiration and public display, between European tradition and American innovation, between past achievement and future ambition. William Wetmore wanted to announce his arrival in Newport society. He succeeded beyond what he could have imagined, though not in ways he anticipated. His house became the template that transformed Newport from summer colony to architectural showcase. George Wetmore wanted to create a residence worthy of his European education. He succeeded, but in doing so helped create a world that would consume itself through competitive excess. Richard Morris Hunt wanted to prove that American architecture could achieve European standards. He succeeded repeatedly, and Chateau-sur-Mer stands as early evidence of that achievement. The house demonstrates that given a sophisticated patron, sufficient resources, and creative freedom, American architects could produce work rivaling anything in Europe. The Preservation Society wanted to save architectural heritage and educate the public. They succeeded, and now thousands of visitors annually experience Gilded Age architecture firsthand rather than through photographs and descriptions. The house serves educational purposes its builders never imagined but might have appreciated. All these aspirations and achievements, all these competing purposes and meanings, coexist within Chateau-sur-Mer's granite walls. The house has been simultaneously statement and sanctuary, showcase and home, private residence, and public monument. It has survived because it was well built, well maintained, and ultimately well loved by people who recognized its significance. Chateau-sur-Mer stands today not as the grandest Newport mansion, or the most expensive or the most famous, but it stands as the first, and that primacy carries meaning. Before the Vanderbilts, before the building boom, before Newport became synonymous with Gilded Age excess, there was Chateau-sur-Mer, the castle by the sea that started it all. The granite walls have stood for over 170 years. They've witnessed transformations of architecture, society, and the nation itself. They've housed merchants and politicians, family life and elaborate entertainments, private cultivation and public education. William Shepherd Wetmore built Chateau-sur-Mer to establish his position in Newport society. He succeeded, though he lived only a decade to enjoy it. His son George transformed the house into something far grander, applying European education and American resources to create one of the Gilded Age's architectural achievements. Richard Morris Hunt proved his genius by taking an existing building and reimagining it as something new while respecting what came before. The house has survived because it meant something to each generation. To William, it meant arrival. To George, it meant cultivation. To the Preservation Society, it means heritage. To visitors today, it means access to a vanished world that shaped modern America. Newport transformed around Chateau-sur-Mer, from modest summer colony to marble playground, and eventually to historic district. The house witnessed every phase of that transformation, sometimes leading change, sometimes adapting to it, ultimately outlasting it. The summer colony is gone. The social structures that sustained it have dissolved, but the architecture remains, testament to ambition, taste, craftsmanship, and the enduring power of buildings to embody human aspiration. Chateau-sur-Mer stands today not as the largest or most elaborate Newport mansion, but it stands as the bridge between what came before and what followed. The house that proved Newport could support serious architectural ambition. The building that demonstrated American wealth could create European quality. The mansion that started the transformation of a quiet resort town into the showcase of Gilded Age America. The castle by the sea endures, and in enduring, it continues to teach, to inspire, and to remind us that architecture at its best is never just about buildings. It's about who we were, who we wanted to be, and what we value enough to preserve for those who come after.